People always think we're attacking NASA, and we're actually NASA enthusiasts when it comes right down to it, right? We're space enthusiasts. We want accountability. We want disclosure. We want to see what's actually there, and we will accept the limitation. We'll support the limitations on what's capable of doing. We don't need to keep researching in and find out, oh, all we're looking at is CGI. If you can't do it, say so.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. It's been, I think, about 3 or 4 months since I've seen this British gentleman. His name is Marcus Allen. Marcus, you need no introduction, but I do want to just mention I really enjoyed the latest copy of Nexus magazine. It was a fascinating read, especially the issue celebrating the 20 best articles in the last 20 years. Maybe you can elaborate more on that. It was fascinating if you can elaborate more. That was absolutely a good read.
It was basically to celebrate the 200th edition of Nexus magazine. Now, Nexus is a bi-monthly, comes out every 2 months, and it started back in the autumn of 1986. So we're talking quite a long time ago. How many other magazines do you know of this nature, alternative magazines, have maintained publication for that period of time and maintain the level of articles? We keep getting calls from people who are saying, it saved my life. Some of the information in it is really good, some of the health information, because we do health articles, we do future science, we do alternative health, hidden history, who built the pyramids? Anybody answer that? Well, we get a gold star because we don't know. And looking into the sort of what's going on in the world that we're not being told about necessarily all the time. This is the latest Nexus. It's on its way to you. It's got articles here about the impact of electricity on living organisms. Well, that's useful. A subject which many people probably don't know very much about is the Richat structure. How many people can say where it is even, let alone what it is? The Richat structure, a geological formation, but it's actually in Mauritania, in West Africa. From a photograph from space, it looks like the description of Atlantis, 3 concentric circles. I'm not saying it is Atlantis because nobody knows. There's a lot of interest now because people are able to examine it from all different sort of angles and look at it in relation to the description given in Plato, where he was talking about it. Very, very few people have even actually been to the Richat structure. It's so isolated in the Western Sahara. There's no reason to go. Well, there is a reason to go now. Anyway, that's current issue of Nexus. It'll be out in North America in February, March, April in North America.
Marcus, there's some interesting developments, shall we say, since the last time you and I have talked. Yeah. I want to give a little bit of background to this subject we're going to talk about. For those of you out there, I know some of the regular viewers on my channel and Robert's channel and, of course, Neil Peel's channel will know who I'm talking about. But for those of you who don't, there's an Apollo moon mission proponent. His name is Steve Mumbling. He's a chap from Australia. And actually, a little background, more background on this. He did a hit piece on me a couple of years ago. He was supposed to appear on Neil Peel's channel, where Marcus is a regular guest, to debate all things Apollo. And he had backed out the last minute. And I said to him, I had messaged him and basically said that, it's unfortunate you backed out. We're looking forward to it. So he said, well, come on my channel. And I said, no. I said, I don't know who you are. And I'm not coming on your channel unless we have some kind of moderator, so on and so forth. So anyway, he did a hit piece on me. You can check it out on his YouTube channel. I'm very proud of the hit piece he did on me, actually. It's Randy Walsh chickens out of a debate. Yes, you'll like it. I'm sure some of the people, regulars on here, have seen that video. So anyway, long story short, he agreed to another appearance on Neil Peel's channel on the Apollo Detectives, again with Marcus in attendance. This time he did follow through on his commitment to appear in the channel. And on the channel was Neil Peel, Ben, Scott Henderson, and of course the one and only Marcus Allen here. And I'm going to let Marcus describe what happened. It was not an interview or a debate. It was a mudslinging match. I mean, I have no other way to describe it on the part of Steve Mumbling. It was the most how shall I say, rather interesting, maybe disturbing discussion on this subject I have ever seen to date. From here now, I'm going to let Marcus fill in all the details and let you know what happened. I will provide a link to the raw version of the Apollo detectives, which Steve Mumbling has in his channel, because he always thought we were going to edit stuff out. And then I'll link the Neil Peel version of it, where him and Ben discuss what had happened here with that interview. So Marcus, please take the floor here, Marcus. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I appreciate that. It's always good to have people who are challenging one. And I've been challenged for the last 30-odd years, ever since I started discussing this. This is quite a recent. The Steve Mumbling event, if you want to call it that, started when I appeared on Ben Emlyn Jones. He was the moderator on the chat. Ben lives in Oxford and he runs the HAPANWU, Hospital Porters Against New World Order. That's what it stands for. He runs a television and a YouTube channel and interview channel, and he's been going for many, many years, probably 10, 15 years, and he's got an incredible collection of interviews. So he was a very good person to have as a moderator, somebody who would introduce everybody. I mean, somebody has to do it. So Ben is very good at it, and he works with Neil Peel, or Neil Geddes-Ward. He works under two names, and he basically introduced us. Now, Ben had organised a conference in Oxford, where he lives, called the Dreaming Saucers Conference, which is a play on the phrase dreaming spires, which is what Oxford is known as. So Dreaming Saucers, that occurred about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was one of the speakers there, and as usual was talking about the Apollo moon landings and how they never happened. It was recorded and posted on Ben's channel and on Neil's channel. It was a routine type of talk that I do, so people have probably heard most of the main points in it, to do with vacuum, to do with pressure, radiation, heat, all the problems we have. Steve Mumbling took exception to this and decided to call me out. Well, that's fair enough. I don't mind being called out. And he posted on his channel his preferred method of recording his own contributions is to have his presumably mobile phone mounted in his car, and he drives around the Australian outback. He actually lives in Western Australia, near Perth. So there's plenty of scope for driving around, and the scenery doesn't change very much because Australia is a big place, full of trees, full of outback, full of not very much interest. Anyway, he drives around and he gives his thoughts on the subject. Now, Steve is an engineer. He's probably 50, 60, something like that. So he's been around the block a few times. Anyway, he decided to call me out and decided that he would say that I was lying because during the talk that I was doing, I referred to humans landing on the moon, astronauts landing on the moon, which is purely my way of describing what's going on. There's no point in saying allegedly every time you talk about people landing on the moon. So I said at the beginning of the talk that I would not be doing allegedly landed on the moon during the talk, but I would say that I don't consider that it has happened. I don't consider that humans have been any nearer to the moon than low Earth orbit. And there are various quite substantial pieces of evidence to support that. Anyway, Steve decided to call me out on this. Well, you said that they landed on the moon. How can you say they didn't? You're a two-faced, snake-tongued idiot who doesn't know what he's talking about. That's the sort of normal response. I didn't respond to it, but Ben Emlyn Jones did, and he took it apart because Ben obviously knew what I was talking about. He'd been at the conference, the Dreaming Saucers conference, and he knows where I'm coming from as regards the Apollo mission. Ben has got much more patience than I have, and he was prepared to sit down and discuss it for an hour or so. Those films are up on his site, so nothing is hidden about this. Anyway, Steve was fairly persistent, and he basically had a go at everybody around who has the temerity to say that Apollo didn't happen. So we invited him to discuss it with us on Neil's channel, Neil Geddes-Ward, his Apollo Detectives segment. Now, what I didn't know at the time, I might explain a little bit about his reticence to appear, was that he'd never ever used Skype. When we eventually did the interview, he actually said, "This is the first time I've ever used Skype. How do you get the chat up? How do you record anything?" So obviously he wasn't familiar with the technology behind Skype. And rather than admit that and say, can you help? Can you give me a hand? How do I record it? How do I share screen? How do I open the chat? It was down to all of us to try to educate him as we went along as to how to use Skype. And he eventually got the hang of it in the end, I suppose, because he was still there 2 hours later. I've experienced a few of these people who challenge me, or challenge anybody who says that Apollo wasn't real. And they have a particular way of going about their business, which is they will attack anybody who has the temerity to even hint at the fact that Apollo might be fake and fiction. So they will attack the individual doing it, usually using personal insults. Oh, you're such an idiot, you don't understand what you're talking about. You can't even answer this question properly. One has trouble working out what the question actually was. And then when you can't sort of come to any conclusion or any agreement with them as to where they stand and where somebody like me or Ben or Neil or yourself or Scott, where they stand, they're not prepared to even discuss it. So basically, that sort of discussion really goes nowhere. I mean, I'm quite prepared to do it, and I've done it with, I think it's 3 or 4 people now. Blue Earth Thing being one of them, who is a chap who lives in, I think it's Alabama or somewhere like that, Central America anyway.
Actually, yeah, I remember that. I was on that particular chat with Blue Earth Thing.
Last I heard, he was building an observatory in his back garden. Maybe he's just occupied by doing that. I don't know.
One thing I'll say about Blue Earth Thing is much and all as we disagreed, and it was still a much better and more constructive discussion than what you had with Steve Mumbling.
Yeah,
Blue Earth Thing wasn't insulting. He didn't use any language. He was civilized. I'll give him credit for that.
Yes, he was. It was actually quite a productive talk. He was willing to go along with some of the things. I explained a few things where I was coming from,
yes,
where he was coming from. So we knew roughly how far we could push each other.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is fine. That's the way it should be.
And that's what I was hoping would happen with Steve Mumbling, but quite the opposite happening. And just before you continue, I encourage everybody to watch, number one, the raw video, which you'll find on Steve Mumbling's channel, and the version that Neil Peel put out. Watch both of them. There's nothing to hide here. It's everything Marcus has been describing so far. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yeah, obviously, Steve was concerned that we would record what was being said and then edit it to our advantage. This is a reasonable assumption to make. So we guaranteed that he would receive the raw footage of the recording, which is what happens on Skype anyway. So I started the recording right at the beginning, and as soon as you record something on Skype, every person taking part receives a copy of that recording automatically. It's basically the way Skype works. So there was no way that we were going to be able to hide anything, not that we would want to hide anything, because we've got nothing to hide. Regrettably, it appears that Steve Mumbling might have had something to hide, because he was talking to Scott originally, and he asked him a question which I couldn't answer. It was to do with the transmission, space parcel loss, something like that.
He was talking to Scott about communications during the Apollo era from the moon. To describe what he was talking about, Scott had used the inverse square law. Steve asked, I thought was a very reasonable question, and I thought, okay, this looks like it's probably going to be a good debate. And it wasn't too long after that as Scott was explaining himself and explaining how he had arrived at his conclusion, Steve Mumbling kept interrupting him, and at one point, Steve called him a cretin. It was over at that point. As far as I'm concerned, the whole thing was over at that point. That's how it continued for the next 2 hours, was name-calling. I remember at one point he said that he's smarter, he's more intelligent than all of you put together. It was almost a little bit like the Buzz Aldrin and Bart Sabrile syndrome, if I could put it that way. I mean, why the violence? I mean, this is something that I've noticed. There's a lot of violence and a lot of threats and a lot of abuse that comes our way, which is why I block people and is why others block people too, because if you want to come on my channel or anyone else's channel for that matter, then you're perfectly within your rights to disagree with me. I have people on my channel right now that disagree with me and you want to argue. As long as they keep it civilized, they're welcome to be on there. But one thing, Marcus, before you continue, for all the Apollo proponents out there, I want to direct your attention to this fact. All of you complain about me, about Marcus, about Neil Peel, or Ben Emlyn Jones censoring your comments or censoring or potentially censoring anybody who comes on to debate us about the Apollo missions, but you don't seem to have a problem with all the other platforms censoring people like us. And we've always been civilized. You don't have a problem with Google or YouTube censoring people. You don't have a problem with Facebook. You don't have a problem with Twitter censoring people, which has now come out. But you seem to have a problem when you accuse us of doing it. You seem to have a problem with that. So I ask you to drop your hypocrisy and look at the reality.
We've got the Steve Mumbling episode. That's probably part 4 of the Trying to Take Us Down episodes. Blue Earth thing was probably one of the first. That was 3 or 4 years ago. Those talks are still up on Robert Williams' channel, also called rather confusingly Apollo Detectives. So if you go onto YouTube, put in Apollo Detectives into the search bar on YouTube, not on Google, on YouTube, you'll find it. But there's about 500 films that Robert Williams has posted about our discussions. I mean, they involve all of us discussing it, and he illustrates them very well because they can follow it much more clearly. There are other people on there as well, Raza Vihari in China. Robert's just posted a discussion I had with Bart Sabrell, looking at some of the more recent developments in the deathbed confession, Gene Akers. Peter Bassett took exception to this, and that we should be censored and we should be admonished by the official regulatory body in the UK for conducting an interview in this way. And we were all actually jaw-dropped, flabbergasted. What is he talking about? Nobody has ever given me advance notice of the questions they were going to ask.
Well, remember, Marcus, when you and I and Bart Sabrell appeared on the HBO interview?
Yeah.
They flew a camera team up here to do the interview with me, and the same with Bart Sabrell, and they interviewed you online. And never once did either of us get an advanced copy of the questions they were going to ask. That's standard procedure. You do not have a right as the interviewee to demand what they're going to ask. You don't have that right.
No, of course
it's standard procedure. They have a right to ask you any question they want at any time on a live recording.
When you get somebody complaining that they were not given advance notice so they could research the question, this is somebody who's supposed to know about it. I'm talking about Peter Bassett here.
Yeah.
He was supposed to know about it. And I thought, this is just so ridiculous that somebody could demand that sort of leeway or latitude in a live radio interview. It wasn't even a television interview, it was a live radio interview. Anyway, Neil Peel, who was the producer of the show at the time, said, no, internet discussions are not regulated in the same way. Which he should have known that, but obviously he didn't. So because he was being rather shown up for not knowing what he was talking about, he decided to complain. About a year ago, I got in touch with him again and suggested that we might like to have a debate in his local astronomy group down in Kent. I said, I'll come along and you can ask me any question you like. Could be an interesting discussion as to what's going on. He said, no, we don't ask people who are not informed about their subject. And I thought, hang on a minute, where's he going with this? Basically, he didn't want to appear with me to be shown up for being incompetent in terms of knowledge of Apollo. So that's the way it goes. And then we have the Steve Mumbling episode, where, as you said, he was fairly abusive to all of us. In fact, that was the first and only time I've ever nearly lost my cool. About an hour in, he was talking over Scott all the time, which is not the way you talk. If you know anything about Skype, you know that as soon as the other person starts talking, you shut up, because if two people are talking at the same time, you can't hear either of them. It's basically just standard etiquette. That's the way these things work. So I basically lost my cool and said, look, just shut up and listen to what is being said.
Well, Steve,
the bottom line is,
come on, Steve.
PDF files here. Do you want me to read them all to you?
Scott has the information there. He's talked about the information before.
This is nonsense.
Let him explain, Steve. Let him explain.
Listen. Shut up and you'll learn something.
You just said that. You like the sound of it. You've got no idea.
It's not rocket science, this. Because by trying to drown us out, by trying to obstruct what we were saying, he was giving away his position, which was that he didn't actually know very much about where we're coming from. He only knew where we were not coming from, which is where he was coming from, which was that Apollo is real, NASA never lies, we all know what we're talking about, You don't know what you're talking about, therefore listen to us because we know what we're talking about. Because NASA wouldn't lie. That's the approach he took.
I lost count the number of times during that interview process with all four of you when he kept saying his fallback position was, Google it, Google it, Google it.
You can Google it yourself, Scott. Why don't you, while we're talking now, just Google the Clark Belt?
One thing that Steve Mumbling that I noticed too, there's an awful lot of negativity coming from him. He just seems to push this negativity out, like you could almost feel it coming off the screen. I mean, I thought at first it was a little bit funny, but then it just got a bit much. I know some people that I know were getting very stressed listening to him. You cannot sit through that whole 2 hours. You have to take a break. That's how negative he was. One thing I noticed with him is that when he's not sure about something, he'll jump on you. He'll talk over you. When you were talking about the film and vacuum, he actually said, oh yeah, that's your strong point. But then when you tried to explain it, he jumped on you. And it was very interesting. He brought up a very good point specific to you when he said, well, NASA were using a specialized film. And my immediate question to him would have been, well, because I was thinking about this, where's that film?
Good point, yeah.
Why is it that every time you proponents out there, for example, Blue Earth Thing or Steve Mumbling or anyone else, every time you bring up something, we find out that it just doesn't exist. It's been destroyed along with all the numerous other so-called evidence that NASA supposedly had that backed up its claim that they went to the moon. And that was the latest one he brought up. Oh, they used a special film. Where is it? Did you document it? Do you have documentation of that? Where is that film? Yes, Steve Mumbling, I'm calling you out. Where is that special film that NASA used successfully in the vacuum of space? Now, you and Robert and Scott actually did an experiment yourselves, and I mentioned this in my second book. I was thinking about this when you were going back and forth with Steve Mumbling. You actually did an experiment. Now, Steve Mumbling accused all of you of not having the proper film that NASA used. Of course, that's nowhere to be found. But you come up with a pretty good counter-argument. But the point is, Marcus, is that you actually did an experiment. You can't do an experiment when it comes to every aspect of the Apollo missions. It's impossible. But that one presented an opportunity, and you, Robert, and Scott jumped at that opportunity. Can you just briefly explain that experiment for people who are watching this video who are not familiar with it? Because I think it's a good counter to Steve Mumbling, where you actually did an experiment. He came back and said, well, NASA used special film that can't be found anywhere, so I just want to emphasize that point. Can you just briefly explain, number one, what the three of you did, and number two, the equivalent altitude that you were able to get from that film, that experiment?
That experiment was brought about as a result of a talk which I attended in London in 2018. It was given by the designer of the camera systems on the Hexagon spy satellite, the KH-9. His name was Phil Pressel, lovely man, and he designed the camera system for use on a spy satellite, because don't forget, prior to that, the U-2 plane piloted by Gary Powers had been shot down over the Soviet Union, as it was then. Therefore, America, if they're going to find out what the Soviet Union were doing, had to have some other means of getting up and being able to photograph activity in the Soviet Union. So they developed various camera systems on various satellites, the Corona system being the first one, and eventually landing up on the Hexagon, which is the KH-9, Keyhole 9. The camera system used photographic film. And that's the key point. Most spy satellites today use digital cameras, not photographic film. There's a very great difference, and it's important to appreciate the difference. You could say, well, you could photograph a newspaper headline from space. Yes, you could, theoretically, because a newspaper headline, 6-inch high letters, is relatively small when you're photographing it from 200 miles up. So what the Hexagon spy satellite was designed to do was a stereo camera setup. That's what made it so special. But it used photographic film, and it carried that on board the Hexagon itself in 30-mile reels of film. I mean, there's a lot of film that's used. Then it was photographed, and all the passageways that the film went through were tubes which were pressurized. Now, that was emphasized by Phil Pressel when he gave his talk. He showed all the diagrams. Another point to remember is that the Hexagon spy satellite was only declassified, or its workings were only declassified in 2011. I heard the talk in 2018 in London. Phil had given the talk before that in America. So I listened to this, and literally a light bulb went off in my head. I thought, hang on a minute, why do you need to pressurize photographic film? What's important about that? I'd never heard that before. That was obviously part of the declassification. So I asked Phil at the end of the talk, I said, would the same requirement be necessary for Apollo? He said, of course it would. Photographic film is destroyed in a vacuum unless it's kept under a small degree of pressure. 1 pound per square inch is a figure he quoted. I thought, hang on a minute. There's no evidence of any of the cameras on the lunar surface being protected from vacuum.
That was 1 pound per square inch. It had to be pressurized to in the camera?
In the camera, yes.
Okay.
The level of pressure was brought about by the use of nitrogen gas bottles. And Phil actually showed the nitrogen gas bottles where they were located near the camera equipment. So it was pretty obvious that they were using nitrogen gas to pressurize the film. Not very high, as I say, 1 pound per square inch is not very high. I mean, top of Mount Everest, you've got pressure about 5 pound per square inch. At sea level here on Earth, it's 14.7 pound per square inch. So we're talking a deterioration of pressure as the higher you go. That's a pretty well-known fact. That's not a conspiracy. That's a scientific fact. Having decided that there was going to be a problem with pressure in cameras, because the Hasselblad cameras were not pressurized. If they had been, you would see it. They would be surrounded by a container of some sort. And they were not, because the Hasselblad cameras on the moon are very, very similar to the photographs shown, and a camera which I have personally handled, a replica Lunar camera. And yes, there are changes in the camera. It has no viewfinder. Now, try taking a photograph without a viewfinder. You can, it's not a problem, but you can't be sure that you're getting in the camera what you want to photograph. And the longer the lens you use, and Hasselblad can use up to 500mm lenses, which have an angle of view of 4.5 degrees. Normally a wide-angle lens would have an angle of view of about 90 degrees. So it's quite easy to get things into the camera. But if you're using 500mm lenses, which they used on Apollo, you see film of them being used, they're just being swept around. I mean, they're about 1 foot long, these lenses, a bit more than 1 foot long. You have to have them on a tripod to hold the thing still enough so you don't get camera shake when you're taking the photograph. There was this idea that film is affected by a vacuum. So Robert Williams, Scott Henderson, myself, Robert and Scott live in Canada, I live in the UK. Robert went out and bought a commercial vacuum chamber to test this, because I explained to him what had happened. He said, that's a really interesting subject. Let's see if we can demonstrate that it's correct or not. So he went out and bought a commercial vacuum chamber. Now, commercial vacuum chambers are relatively low-level vacuum. They don't produce a very high level. So this particular one, and most commercial vacuum chambers, can produce torr 10 to the minus 3 of vacuum. As a result of doing that, and we published our findings, and we detailed our findings on the AULIS website, that's AULIS.com website, probably the foremost website of this whole area. A lot of people post on there, French scientists, German scientists, Russian scientists, Chinese scientists have posted on that. And AULIS takes the view that man has not walked on the lunar surface as we have been told. We did this, it's published on the AULIS website. Various people had seen it, and one person who saw it was a professor at the university in Greece who said, you're right, I hadn't considered this, but you're quite right about the vacuum. I'm a materials scientist. I know about vacuum. That's what I work with. Because there are various commercial applications for the use of a vacuum in science. He said, I'm prepared to do some experiments for you. I have a vacuum chamber that will produce torr 10 to the minus 6. And I will do it. Now, that is actually ongoing as we speak. This is February 2023. He's received some of the film that we used in the previous experiment, but he's going to be doing it at a much higher level. And one of the points he made was that when you get above torr 10 to the minus 4, then the magic happens. Basically, you don't know what's going to happen when you put material into it. He's a material scientist. He's used to putting materials of different sorts, whether it's electronics or different types of metals, into a vacuum chamber just to see what the effect is going to be. The point is that if NASA knew that a vacuum would affect photographic film, which they must have done because the Hexagon Spy satellite was launched after Apollo, so you'd think that NASA would know that there were problems with photographic film. If they didn't know there were problems with photographic film, then either they have been very lax in their investigation, and they used a lot of different commercial companies to investigate them, and you can find all these thousands of pages of technical reports on the NASA website, and they report them. But the interesting thing is when you read them, which I've done, not all of them, because there are tens of thousands of pages, it would take a lifetime to read them all, you find that a lot of these companies, these are very highly qualified technical companies in America, who, in this particular case, are examining the effect of vacuum on photographic film. And they said it will be affected unless precautions are taken to prevent the damage by a vacuum to photographic film. What they don't then say is what happened next. Were precautions taken? We don't know. This is the point. But yes, there are a lot of investigations, and most of them find out that there are problems. I mean, the same thing with radiation, same thing with heat. These are the three major problems in space. So if you contracted with an external company, NASA are basically a contracting agent for various specialist companies. EG&G was this particular one. And they examined it and said, yes, there will be a problem, and this is what the problem is, and this is why it happens. All right, they pointed out that there are problems to NASA. There's no evidence that NASA, A, took them seriously and did anything about it, because there are no further reports saying, well, this is what we did to try to resolve that problem, and this is the result of that test to resolve it. No, that doesn't occur. That is one of the major features throughout the whole Apollo program.